Welcome to the London Gritty Chronicles. Today, we step into a world where the air itself was considered a weapon. This is the story of the Miasma Theory. Imagine standing on the banks of the River Thames in the year 1348. If you close your eyes and take a deep breath in modern London, you might smell diesel fumes, perhaps the faint scent of rain on concrete, or the aroma of coffee from a nearby shop. But if we dial the clock back nearly 700 years, that same breath would be an assault on your senses. It would not just be unpleasant. According to the greatest minds of the medieval era, that breath could kill you. We often look back at history and judge the medical practices of the past. We see the strange masks, the burning herbs, and the bloodletting, and we might think these people were simply uneducated. But that is a mistake. They were following a strict, logical system of belief. They were battling an invisible enemy with the only weapons they understood. To truly understand history and to improve your English fluency, we must learn to describe these past beliefs with respect and precision. In this series, we will explore the Miasma Theory, the belief that bad air caused disease. We will walk through the smoke-filled streets of medieval cities, witness the desperate rituals to purify the atmosphere, and see how this mistaken theory actually laid the groundwork for modern sanitation. Let us begin by setting the scene. The year is 1348. The location is a narrow street in London, though it could be Paris, Florence, or Venice. The streets are not paved with asphalt. They are packed dirt, often turned to mud by rain. Running down the center of the street is a kennel or a gutter. This is not for rainwater alone. In a time before modern plumbing, this gutter carries the waste of the city. Animal manure, butcher's scraps, and human waste flow openly through the neighborhood. In the summer heat, this mixture cooks. It releases a thick, heavy stench that hangs between the overhanging timber houses. To a modern observer, this is a hygiene crisis. To a medieval citizen, this is a spiritual and medical emergency. This brings us to our first key concept, miasma. The word comes from ancient Greek, meaning pollution or stain. By the medieval period, it referred specifically to a poisonous vapor or mist filled with particles from decomposing matter. Listen to that phrase, decomposing matter. This refers to things that are rotting. The belief was that when organic material, like food, waste, or bodies, rotted, it released a corrupting gas into the air. If you inhaled this gas, it did not just sit in your lungs, it disrupted the balance of your entire body. In academic English, when we describe a theory that is no longer accepted as fact, we use specific language to distance ourselves from the claim while acknowledging that people believed it at the time. We might say, it was widely believed that smells could transmit disease, or physicians reasoned that the air contained invisible poisons. Notice the verb reasoned. It implies logic. The miasma theory was not magic. It was an observation. When people lived near swamps or piles of rotting garbage, they got sick more often. Therefore, the smell must be the cause. It is a classic case of confusing correlation, two things happening together, with causation, one thing causing the other. But why did this theory hold such power? To answer that, we must look at the medical authority of the time, the legacy of Galen and Hippocrates. Ancient Greek and Roman medicine dominated medieval thinking. The core belief was that the human body contained four fluids known as humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a state of balance. Sickness was a state of imbalance. Miasma was the trigger for this imbalance. The theory suggested that bad air entered the body and corrupted the humors, specifically the blood and the heart. The air was the medium of infection. Just as sound travels through the air to your ear, they believed disease traveled through the air to your heart, and this made the atmosphere terrifying. If the wind changed direction, blowing from a swamp toward the city, it could bring death. If a dog died in the street and began to rot, the air around it became a sphere of influence for sickness. Let's pause on a useful English expression here. Prevailing theory. The word prevailing means the most common or dominant idea at a specific time. In the 14th century, miasma was the prevailing theory of disease transmission. Because this was the prevailing theory, it dictated behavior. If the air is the enemy, how do you fight it? You cannot shoot an arrow at the wind. You cannot put the air in prison. The logical response was modification. You had to change the air. This led to a fascinating and desperate industry of scents and fumigation. Wealthy citizens would carry pomanders, balls of ambergris, musk, or in herbs, held constantly to their noses. The idea was to create a personal bubble of good air to block the bad air. Imagine walking through a market. You see a merchant negotiating a price for wool. Suddenly, a gust of wind carries the smell of the tanneries, where leather is treated with urine. The merchant stops talking, panic in his eyes, and immediately presses a cloth soaked in vinegar to his face. He is not just avoiding a bad smell, he is shielding himself from a perceived deadly weapon. This fear shaped the architecture of cities and the laws of kings. In London, King Edward III grew so alarmed by the fumes of the city that he wrote a letter to the mayor of London in 1357. He complained that the air was infected and corrupted by the filth in the streets. He ordered the city to be cleaned, not because he liked cleanliness, but because he feared the fumes would kill his soldiers. Here we see a critical connection, the biology-society mirror. The internal fear of biological infection, bad humors, led to external social controls, street cleaning laws. The belief in miasma actually forced cities to become cleaner, even though the reasoning was technically wrong. They were cleaning up the bacteria-laden filth, thinking they were cleaning up the smell. They were right about the action, but wrong about the mechanism. However, in 1348, a new threat arrived that would push the miasma theory to its absolute limit. Rumors began to circulate from the ports of Europe. Sailors spoke of a great pestilence in the east. They told stories of cities where the dead outnumbered the living. They whispered that this new disease struck with terrifying speed. People would go to sleep healthy and never wake up. The physicians of London checked their charts. They looked at the alignment of the planets. They sniffed the air. The summer had been wet and warm, perfect conditions for rot. The air felt heavy. The miasma theorists were confident. They believed they understood the enemy. They prepared their fires. They gathered their herbs. They believed that if they could just purify the atmosphere, they would be safe. They were wrong. Something was approaching London that defied all their calculations. It was not just a cloud of bad air. It was a biological agent, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, carried not by the wind, but by the fleas on the rats scurrying through those very gutters. Now, as the ships docked at Southampton and the first crates were unloaded, the invisible passengers hopped ashore. The Miasma Theory was about to face its greatest challenge. The bad air was not coming from the swamps. It was coming from inside the houses, from the clothes of the neighbors, and from the ships that brought their food. The stage is set. The theory is established. The city is waiting. But as the first victims fall, the people will realize that their sweet-smelling herbs might not be enough to stop the darkness spreading across Europe. How did the medieval world attempt to cure a disease they couldn't see? And what happens when a belief system clashes with a reality that destroys a third of the population? The ships arrived in silence, but the chaos that followed was deafening. It is October 1348, and the gray clouds over London are not just bringing rain. They are bringing a shadow that will cover the sun for years. The first victims are falling in the port towns. They do not fade away slowly, like the old or the weak. They are struck down with violent suddenness, fever, black swellings, and blood. But here is the twist that confused the medieval mind. The air smelled normal. According to the Miasma Theory, a disease this deadly should be accompanied by a stench so powerful it would knock you over. Yet, the autumn breeze was crisp. This contradiction terrified the population. If the air didn't smell bad yet, but people were dying, it meant the corruption was invisible, silent, and arguably more dangerous. The prevailing logic shifted slightly. If the smell wasn't obvious, the air must be stagnant. Now let's look at a useful English term, stagnant. This adjective describes water or air that does not flow or move and often smells unpleasant as a result. Think of a pond with green scum on top. That is stagnant water. Medieval doctors believed that stagnant air was like a trap. It allowed the poisonous particles to gather in one place, hovering over a house or a street, waiting to be inhaled. So, the city began a desperate campaign to break the air. Imagine the soundscape of a medieval city in panic. You might expect silence and mourning. Instead, you hear a cacophony. Church bells ring incessantly, not just for funerals, but for public health. The vibration of the heavy bronze bells was believed to shake the atmosphere, breaking up the pockets of poison. In the wealthier districts, another sound emerged. Servants were ordered to bang pots and pans, or even fire early handheld explosive powders. The goal was purely physical. Agitate the air. Agitate is a strong verb meaning to make something move violently or to disturb it. They were trying to beat the air into submission. Inside the homes, a different battle was being waged. If the air outside was dangerous, the air inside must be fortified. This is where we see the rise of fumigation. To fumigate means to use smoke or fumes to disinfect or purify an area. Today, we might fumigate a house to kill termites. In 1348, they fumigated to kill the invisible miasma. Picture a wealthy merchant's bedroom. The windows are sealed tight with heavy tapestries. The room is hot and smoky. In the center stands a brazier, a metal pan holding burning coals. On these coals, the family burns rosemary, lavender, and frankincense. If they are rich, they burn expensive Eastern spices. If they are poor, they burn old shoes or dried manure. The logic was simple. Fight a bad smell with a strong smell. The smoke was a barrier. It was a shield. Let's focus on the language of prevention here. When we describe these actions, we often use the phrasal verb ward off. To ward off means to try to prevent something bad from harming you. They burned herbs to ward off the sickness. You might also hear the word mitigate. To mitigate means to make something less severe or painful. They hoped the smoke would mitigate the risk of infection. But as the winter of 1348 approached, a chilling realization set in. The people ringing the bells were dying. The servants banging the pots were collapsing in the streets. Even the merchants in their sealed, smoky rooms were waking up with the telltale black boils on their necks. Why? Because the miasma theory had a fatal blind spot. It focused entirely on the atmosphere, the air, ignoring the vectors, the carriers. A vector is an organism like a mosquito or a tick that transmits a disease. In this case, the vector was the flea. These fleas lived on black rats. When the rats died from the plague, and the fleas jumped to the nearest warm body, a human. The irony is tragic. By sealing themselves indoors to escape the bad air, families actually trapped themselves inside with the rats that lived in their walls and floors. The smoke didn't bother the fleas. The sealed windows just meant the rats couldn't leave. The very rituals designed to save them were arguably making the transmission easier in the cramped medieval houses. This is the accidental twist of our story. The harder they tried to control the air, the more helpless they were against the insect. Yet, the human mind struggles to accept chaos. We crave a reason. If the fumigation failed, the doctors concluded it wasn't because the theory was wrong. It was because the corruption was too strong. They needed more drastic measures. They stopped looking at the air and started looking at the body itself. If the poison has already been inhaled, they reasoned, it is circulating in the blood. Therefore, the blood itself must be cleaned. This logic leads us to one of the most infamous and misunderstood practices in medical history: bloodletting. We often view bloodletting as barbaric torture, but remember our empathetic approach. To a medieval physician, the body was a container of fluids under pressure. If the container is overheating, fever, and filled with poison, miasma, the most logical engineering solution is to open a valve and release the pressure. The cure was about to become as dangerous as the disease. The barber surgeons were sharpening their blades. They were preparing to drain the bad blood, to make room for the good. But how do you tell a terrified patient that cutting their arm is the only way to survive? And what happens when the physicians themselves start dying with the lancet in their hands? They couldn't scrub the sky, so they tried to drain the man. When the smoke cleared in the fumigated bedrooms, the patients were still burning with fever. The miasma theory said the air had poisoned them. Now, the poison was inside. The logic of the time dictated that if a bucket is filled with dirty water, you must pour it out before you can add clean water. The human body was treated exactly like that bucket. This brings us to the door of the barber surgeon. Notice the title. In medieval England, university-trained physicians were academics. They studied books and stars. They rarely touched patients. If you needed physical intervention, a tooth pulled, a bone set, or blood drawn, you went to the barber. Yes, the same person who trimmed beards also performed surgery. The red and white striped pole you see outside modern barber shops is a grim memory of this history. White for the bandages, red for the blood. Step inside a barber surgeon's shop in 1349. The air here smells different, metallic and sharp. It smells of iron. A patient sits on a wooden stool, pale and sweating. He rolls up his sleeve. He's terrified, yet he is also hopeful. He believes his veins are swollen with corrupted humors. He feels heavy. He wants the pressure released. The barber takes a small double-edged blade called a lancet. This is a key vocabulary word for medical history. A lancet is a surgical knife with a sharp point, used to make small punctures. With a practiced flick of the wrist, the barber opens a vein in the patient's arm. Dark blood flows into a brass bowl. The patient sighs. In that moment, the dizziness of blood loss feels like relief. He thinks the fever is leaving him. In reality, his life force is draining into the bowl. Let's pause to examine the English used to describe this intent. The goal was to restore equilibrium. Equilibrium is a sophisticated noun meaning a state of physical or mental balance. The medieval worldview was obsessed with balance. They believed the body was a microcosm of the universe. If the universe was out of order, bad air, the body became out of order. Fever. Bloodletting was an attempt to force the body back into equilibrium. Another useful verb here is alleviate. To alleviate means to make suffering, deficiency, or a problem less severe. The barber didn't promise to cure the plague instantly. He promised to alleviate the symptoms by cooling the blood. There were precise rules for this. You couldn't just cut anywhere. Astrological charts determined the best time to bleed. If the moon was in the sign of Gemini, you might bleed the arms. If it was in Pisces, you might avoid the feet. It was a complex system of sympathetic magic masquerading as science. Sometimes they didn't use knives. They used leeches. These small, water-dwelling worms were placed on the skin to suck the blood out slowly. This was considered a gentler option for the wealthy or the weak. But here is the biological tragedy. The bubonic plague attacks the lymph nodes and the immune system. The victim's heart is already struggling to pump blood against the infection. By draining a pint of blood, the barber surgeon was actually inducing shock. Shock, in medical terms, is a critical condition where the body isn't getting enough blood flow. By trying to let the poison out, they were destroying the body's ability to fight. The patient would leave the shop paler and cooler, which looked like an improvement, but they were actually closer to death. This biology society mirror is painful to watch. The society valued action. Doing something, even the wrong thing, felt better than doing nothing. The visual of the blood filling the bowl gave both the doctor and the patient a sense of control. Look, they could say, we are removing the sickness. But as the death tolls mounted, even the most devout believers in bloodletting began to doubt. The cemeteries were filling up too fast. The bad air wasn't clearing, and the bad blood wasn't the only culprit. If the air was the weapon and the body was the battlefield, who was the general? Who was sending this attack? When physical cures fail, humanity turns to the metaphysical. When the doctor cannot save you, you look for a priest. But in 1349, the priests were dying too. The realization hit the population like a hammer. This was not just a disease. This was a judgment. And if God was angry, simple prayers were not enough. The people needed a way to show they were sorry. A way that was as violent and extreme as the disease itself. The sound of the barber's lancet was about to be replaced by a much louder, more terrifying sound. The crack of the whip. When the medicine failed, the madness began. It is late 1349. The bloodletting has not lowered the fever. The burning herbs have not cleared the air. The people of London look at the gray sky and no longer see a weather system. They see the face of an angry God. If the doctors could not cure the body, the people decided they must cure the soul. And the cure they chose was one of the most disturbing spectacles in human history. Imagine standing in a village square. The normal noise of the market has stopped. In the distance, you hear a low, rhythmic chanting. It grows louder, accompanied by the thud of heavy footsteps. Then they appear. They are the flagellants, a column of men, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, marches 2 by 2. They wear simple white robes with red crosses painted on the front and back. Their heads are bowed. They do not look at the crowd. They reach the center of the square and strip to the waist. They form a circle. At a signal from their leader, the chanting rises to a shout. They raise leather whips, heavy cords knotted with iron spikes, and bring them down over their shoulders. Snap. Thud. They strike themselves once, twice, again. They do not stop until the blood flows down their backs, mingling with the mud of the street. They are not fighting an enemy soldier. They are fighting the sin inside themselves. This brings us to a crucial English concept: penance. Penance is an act of self-punishment performed to show sorrow for a sin. It is related to the word penalty. The flagellants believed that the plague was a divine penalty for the wickedness of humanity. Therefore, by punishing themselves voluntarily, they hoped to satisfy God's anger, so he would not have to punish them with the plague. Closely related is the word atonement. To atone means to make things right, usually after doing something wrong. The flagellants were trying to atone for the sins of the entire world. To the modern mind, this looks like mass hysteria. But let's use our historical lens. Remember the Miasma Theory? The belief was that the air was corrupted. But why was it corrupted? The physicians said planetary alignment, or rotting matter. The priests said human sin. In this worldview, a lie told by a merchant or an act of greed was not just a moral failing. It was a pollutant. It was a piece of spiritual garbage that rotted and steamed, rising up to poison the atmosphere. If enough people sinned, the air turned bad, and God sent the pestilence. So, the flagellants offered a transaction. They offered their own pain in exchange for clean air. The movement started in Eastern Europe and swept westward, arriving in England in late 1349. They followed strict rules. They were forbidden to bathe. They could not change their clothes. They marched for exactly 33 days, 1 day for each year of Jesus Christ's life. For the desperate English peasants watching from the sidelines, this was a powerful show. Here were men taking control. They weren't just waiting to die. They were bleeding with a purpose. Let's look at the grammar of desperation. When people feel helpless, they often turn to radical solutions. The word radical comes from the Latin word for root. A radical solution tries to pull the problem out by the roots. The flagellants believed the root of the plague was not the rat, but the soul. However, this movement brought a new danger to the authorities. The flagellants claimed they had a direct line to God. They didn't need the permission of the Pope or the King to march. They interrupted church services. They claimed their blood was as holy as the communion wine. This leads to a conflict of authority. In medieval society, power was hierarchical. God was at the top, then the Pope, then the King, then the people. The flagellants tried to bypass the middle management. By late 1349, the Pope and the King realized that these wandering bands of bleeding men were causing more chaos than the plague itself. They were stirring up the crowds. They were questioning the church's ability to save the people. The mood shifted. The authorities began to suppress them. The gates of London were barred against them. The saviors became outlaws, but the psychological damage was done. The flagellants had planted a dark idea in the minds of the people. Someone is to blame. If the plague is a punishment for sin, then who are the sinners? If whipping ourselves isn't stopping the disease, maybe it's because those people over there are still sinning. The logic of miasma, the air is poisoned, combined with the logic of religious zealotry, God is angry, to create a toxic new theory. The air isn't just bad by accident. Someone is poisoning it on purpose. The search for a cure was ending. The hunt for a scapegoat was beginning. A scapegoat is a person or group who is unfairly blamed for the problems of others. As the flagellants faded from the streets, the fear they generated needed a new target, and the eyes of the mob turned toward the minority communities living among them. The narrative was about to shift from bad air to bad people, and the violence that followed would leave a stain on history that no amount of rain could wash away. The logic of fear is a slippery slope. It starts with the air is bad, moves to God is angry, and inevitably ends at who is doing this to us? It is 1349. The flagellants have been banned, but the plague rages on. The people are exhausted. They have fumigated their homes, bled their veins, and whipped their backs. Nothing has worked. The silence in the streets is now heavy with suspicion. If the wells of the city are not drying up, and the air is not clearing, a new and terrible rumor begins to spread. Sabotage. The rumor was whispered first in the marketplaces of Europe. It then shouted in the town squares. The Jews are poisoning the wells. This is the darkest chapter of the miasma story, and we must handle it with solemn accuracy. It demonstrates how a medical theory about pollution can be twisted into a justification for murder. The concept is scapegoating. We touched on this word before. A scapegoat is the innocent victim of collective rage. But why did they choose the Jewish communities? In medieval Europe, Jewish people lived in segregated communities. They had different customs, different dietary laws, and often better hygiene practices due to religious rituals involving hand washing and bathing. Because of this, sometimes, only sometimes, Jewish communities had lower death rates from the plague. To a panicked medieval mob, this discrepancy was not evidence of hygiene, it was evidence of guilt. Why are they not dying as fast as we are? The mob asked. The answer they invented was conspiracy. Let's analyze the language of conspiracy. A conspiracy theory usually involves a secret plot by a group to harm others. The mob believed the miasma was being artificially created. They claimed that Jewish leaders were conspiring to destroy Christianity by dropping poison sachets into the public water supply. This accusation led to the Strasbourg massacre and similar atrocities across Europe. In city after city, angry mobs rounded up Jewish citizens. They were given a horrific choice: convert to Christianity or burn. Thousands were murdered. We must use the word pogrom here. A pogrom is an organized massacre of a particular ethnic group. The attacks in 1349 were pogroms fueled by medical ignorance. The tragedy is that the accusation was scientifically impossible. The plague was spread by fleas, not water. Poisoning a well in a massive city would require gallons of toxin, which didn't exist. Furthermore, Jews drank from the same wells. They were dying too. But facts do not stop a panic. In English, we have a phrase, mass hysteria. This describes a situation where extreme fear and irrational behavior spread rapidly through a group of people. The belief in well poisoning was a form of mass hysteria. It allowed the people to feel a false sense of control. If the plague was caused by a person, you could kill the person and stop the plague. It was a terrifyingly simple solution to a complex biological problem. While these horrors were unfolding on the continent, the situation in London was slightly different, but equally grim. The social order was collapsing, but in a way that would eventually change the English language and economy forever. The bad air was killing the workforce. Walk through a London field in late 1349. The harvest is rotting on the stalk. The sheep are wandering aimlessly because the shepherds are dead. The cows are unmilked. The feudal system, the strict hierarchy of lords and peasants, relied on a surplus of cheap labor. But suddenly, labor was scarce. The accidental twist of the plague was that it gave power to the survivors. If a lord wanted his crops harvested, he had to ask the few remaining peasants. And for the first time in history, the peasant could say, "No, unless you pay me more." This is the concept of leverage. Leverage is the power to influence a situation to achieve a desired result. The miasma had killed so many people that the survivors now had leverage. The English Parliament was terrified of this. They didn't fear the well poisoners as much as they feared the demanding peasant. In 1351, they passed the Statute of Laborers. This law tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It made it illegal to refuse work or to ask for higher pay. It was a desperate attempt to turn back the clock, but you cannot legislate against supply and demand. The bad air had blown away the old world order. So, while the mobs in Europe were hunting for scapegoats, the peasants of England were quietly realizing their own worth. The fear of the invisible poison was beginning to be replaced by a new kind of hunger, a hunger for freedom and fair pay. The Miasma Theory had failed to save the population. It had failed to explain the death. It had led to torture and massacre. But as the first wave of the pandemic finally began to recede, the survivors looked around at a landscape that was strangely empty. The air was still the same. The smells were still there. But half the voices were gone. What happens to a society when the silence settles? How do you rebuild a world when the experts were wrong about everything? The survivors were about to discover that while they couldn't fix the air, they could fix the city. The failure of the Miasma Theory was about to birth the very first attempts at public health. The bodies were buried, but the smell remained. And for the King of England, that was a problem. It is 1357. The worst years of the Black Death have passed, leaving a scar on the population. London is trying to return to business, but as the summer sun heats the city, the miasma returns. The fear is palpable. Everyone believes that if the stench gets too strong, the sickness will come back. This leads us to a pivotal moment in the history of public health. It is the moment when the government decided that bad air was not just a personal problem, it was a crime. King Edward III was a warrior king, famous for fighting the French. But in 1357, he found himself fighting a pile of garbage. One afternoon, riding along the banks of the Thames, the king was reportedly overcome by the fumes rising from the river. The butchers of St. and Nicholas Shambles, a meat market, had been throwing offal, animal organs, and blood directly into the water. The river was effectively an open sewer. Edward did not just cover his nose. He wrote a letter. This document is a masterclass in angry formal English. He wrote to the mayor of London, complaining that the air was corrupted and infected by the dung and other filth in the streets. He warned that this smell was a great peril to his people. This brings us to a key English term, ordinance. An ordinance is a law or rule made by a local authority, like a city government. King Edward didn't just ask nicely, he demanded an ordinance. He ordered that the streets be cleaned and that the butchers stop dumping waste in the city. Notice the shift in strategy. During the plague, the focus was on defense, smelling herbs, staying inside. Now, the focus shifted to offense, removing the source of the smell. To enforce this, a new and fascinating profession became essential to London life: the gong farmer. This is not a farmer who grows crops. The word gong is Old English for a latrine or toilet. A gong farmer was a man paid to empty the cesspits of the city. Imagine their life. They were the nightmen. By law, they were only allowed to work after dark, usually between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., because the smell of their work was considered too dangerous for the daytime public. They would travel to a house, lift the heavy stone slabs covering the cesspit, and climb down into the waste. They shoveled the human refuse into buckets, carried it up, and loaded it onto carts. They then had to transport it outside the city walls to designated dumps. It was backbreaking, disgusting work. But here's the surprise: they were paid very well. In a world terrified of miasma, the man who took the poison away was an essential worker. A gong farmer could earn more than a skilled carpenter. They were the hazmat teams of the medieval world. They were paid a premium for what we call hazard pay, extra money for dangerous working conditions. Let's look at the vocabulary of prohibition. To prohibit means to officially forbid something. The king prohibited the dumping of waste. To penalize means to punish someone for breaking a rule. If a citizen threw trash in the street, they could be penalized with a fine of 2 shillings, a huge amount of money at the time. These laws created the concept of civic responsibility. Before the plague, your garbage was your business. After the plague, your garbage was everyone's threat. If you let your pile of manure rot, you weren't just being messy. You were potentially creating a miasmatic cloud that could kill your neighbors. This is the Biology Society mirror in action. The biological fear of the nose created the social structure of the sanitation department. Of course, the tragedy of the miasma theory remains. They were cleaning the streets to stop the smell. They didn't know that by removing the piles of food waste and filth, they were actually removing the food source for the rats. They were doing the right thing for the wrong reason. The streets of London became cleaner than they had been in centuries. The river, though still dirty by modern standards, was protected by new laws. The city was trying to sterilize itself. But as the city cleaned up, a new intellectual movement was beginning to stir. The doctors who survived the plague began to look at their old books with suspicion. Galen and Hippocrates said the humors controlled everything. But the plague had killed the strong and the weak, the balanced and the unbalanced. The blind faith in ancient authority was cracking. A few brave souls began to ask questions that would eventually lead to the birth of modern science. They began to observe patterns. One such pattern was that the disease seemed to move not just with the wind, but with contact. If miasma, air, is the only cause, why did the nuns who washed the bodies of the dead almost always die? Why did the disease travel along trade routes, exactly as fast as a horse or a ship could travel? The wind moves faster than a horse. If it was just the air, the disease should have struck everywhere at once. But it didn't. It traveled, and this observation paved the way for a dangerous new idea, one that contradicted the miasma theory. The idea of contagion. Contagion refers to the spread of disease from one person to another by close contact. To us, this is obvious. To a medieval scholar, this was a debate. As the 14th century turned into the 15th, the battle lines were drawn between the air theorists and the contact theorists. And nowhere was this battle more visible than in the ports of Italy, where a new invention was about to change the English language forever. It was a policy involving the number 40, a period of isolation designed to wait out the hidden poison. You know this word. We all learned it intimately in 2020, but its origin story lies right here in the ashes of the miasma theory. The city walls could keep out an army, but they could not keep out a merchant with a cough. It is 1377. We are moving south from London to the sunny, fortified port of Ragusa, known today as Dubrovnik in Croatia. The city council is terrified. They know the plague comes from the sea carried by ships arriving from infected ports. They cannot ban trade. The city would starve, but they cannot allow free entry. The city would die. So they invent a pause button. They pass a law. Any ship arriving from a plague-ridden area must drop anchor outside the harbor. The crew cannot step onto the land. The citizens cannot step onto the ship. They must float there, in the heat, for 30 days. If, after 30 days, the sailors are still alive, they are allowed to enter. This was initially called a Trentino, based on the number 30. But soon, doctors and officials decided 30 days wasn't enough. They looked for a number with more weight, both medically and spiritually. They chose 40. In Italian, the word for 40 is quaranta. From this, we get the English word quarantine. Let's explore the definition of this essential noun. Quarantine is a state, period, or place of isolation in which people or animals that have arrived from elsewhere or been exposed to infectious or contagious disease are placed. Why 40? The reasoning was a mix of the biology society mirror. Biologically, Greek medicine taught that acute illnesses usually revealed themselves within 40 days. Spiritually, the number 40 was sacred. The biblical flood lasted 40 days. Jesus fasted in the desert for 40 days. Lent is 40 days. To the medieval mind, 40 days was the time required for purification. Imagine the experience of a sailor in 14th century Venice. You have survived a dangerous voyage. You can see the tavern where you want to drink. You can see the church where you want to pray. But you are forced to sail to a small, lonely island in the lagoon, a lazaretto. A lazaretto was a quarantine station. It was half hospital, half prison. Here, we find useful vocabulary about restriction. The authorities would detain the ship. To detain meant to keep someone in official custody or to delay them. The isolation was mandatory. Mandatory means required by law or rules. It is the opposite of optional. On these islands, the goods, wool, silk, cloth, were unloaded and treated. Believing in miasma, the workers would air out the fabrics. They might smoke them with herbs or wash them in vinegar, thinking the bad air was trapped in the fibers. They were accidentally right, but for the wrong reason. The fleas hiding in the wool would likely die of starvation or jump off during the 40-day wait. The lazaretto system was harsh. If one person on the island showed symptoms, the clock often reset for everyone. It was a place of boredom, fear, and death. But for the city across the water, it was a miracle. The cities that strictly enforced quarantine survived while others collapsed. This success created a massive crack in the miasma theory. Think about it. If the disease is caused by bad air blowing across the world, why would stopping a ship make a difference? The wind blows past the ship. The air moves freely, and the success of quarantine proved that the disease was not in the atmosphere. It was in the bodies and the goods. It was portable. This is the concept of contagion taking root. However, human beliefs are stubborn. Even with this evidence, the miasma theory did not vanish. It was too deeply embedded in the culture. People simply combined the two ideas. They believed that a sick person exuded a personal miasma, a small cloud of bad air that surrounded them. So, for the next 500 years, Europe lived in a confused middle ground. They used quarantine, fighting contagion, while still wearing beak masks filled with herbs, fighting miasma. This confusion would have deadly consequences in London centuries later. We must jump forward in time now. The year is 1854. London is the largest, wealthiest city on earth. It is the center of the British Empire. It is paved, industrialized, and modern. But there is a problem. The miasma theory is still the prevailing medical doctrine. The leading public health official, a man named Edwin Chadwick, is a firm believer that all smell is disease. Chadwick wants to save London from cholera. He believes the smell from the cesspits under the houses is causing the outbreaks. So, he orders a massive engineering project to flush all the waste into the River Thames. He thinks he is removing the miasma. In reality, he is dumping the bacteria directly into the city's drinking water supply. The cure is about to cause one of the most famous outbreaks in history. And it will take a quiet, stubborn doctor named John Snow to finally kill the miasma theory once and for all. He will not use an army. He will not use a fumigation torch. He will use a map. The air was clean, but the water was deadly. We arrive in London in the summer of 1854. The medieval timber houses are gone, replaced by brick factories and crowded tenements. The city is the engine of the Industrial Revolution. But despite steam trains and telegraphs, the medical experts are still stuck in the 14th century. They are terrified of a disease called cholera. Cholera is a brutal killer. It strikes the gut, causing such violent dehydration that a healthy person can turn blue and die within hours. In 1854, the leading minds of the Board of Health were absolutely convinced of the cause: miasma. They believed that the bad air rising from the overflowing basements of London was the trigger. Their solution was to flush the waste out of the houses and into the River Thames. This brings us to a tragic irony. By cleaning the air, they poisoned the water. The Thames was the main source of drinking water for the city. They were effectively piping the disease from the toilet to the tap. But one man stood apart from the crowd. His name was Dr. John Snow. John Snow was a skeptic. In English, a skeptic is a person who questions accepted opinions or facts. He was already famous for giving Queen Victoria chloroform during childbirth. Because he worked with gases, anesthetics, he understood how gases behaved. He looked at miasma logic and found a flaw. If the disease came from the air, surely the lungs would be infected first. But cholera attacked the stomach. Therefore, he reasoned, the poison must be swallowed, not inhaled. He called it a waterborne disease. Waterborne is an adjective meaning carried by water. In late August 1854, a catastrophic outbreak hit the Soho district of London. In just 10 days, over 500 people died within a few blocks of each other. The miasma theorists said, "Look, the air in Soho must be incredibly corrupt." John Snow did not sniff the air. He knocked on doors. This is the birth of epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread. Snow acted like a detective. He walked the streets of Golden Square. He asked the grieving families a simple question. Where did you get your water? The answer was almost always the same. The pump on Broad Street. The Broad Street pump was famous for its cold, clear, sparkling water. People loved it. They walked past other pumps to drink there. Snow went home and drew a map. In this ghost map is one of the most important documents in history. He marked every death with a black bar. The bars stacked up high around Broad Street and thinned out as you moved away. But Snow needed more than a pattern. He needed to explain the anomalies. An anomaly is something that deviates from what is standard, normal, or expected. There were two huge anomalies on his map. 1. A local brewery right next to the pump had almost 0 deaths. 2. A nearby workhouse, a prison for the poor, also had very few deaths. If miasma, bad air, was the killer, everyone in those buildings should be dead. They were breathing the same air as the victims. Snow visited the brewery. The workers told him, "We don't drink water, sir. We drink beer." The brewing process involved boiling the water, which killed the bacteria, though they didn't know that. He visited the workhouse. They had their own private well. The evidence was overwhelming. It was empirical. Empirical means based on observation or experience, rather than theory or pure logic. Miasma was theory. The map was empirical. On September 7th, 1854, John Snow walked into a meeting of the local board of guardians. He was a quiet man, not a shouter. He laid out his map. He explained the brewery. He explained the victims. He asked them to do one simple thing. He didn't ask for a new sewer system. He didn't ask for prayers. He said, "Remove the handle from the Broad Street pump." The guardians were reluctant. They still believed in miasma. They couldn't understand how a clean-looking water pump could kill people. But out of desperation, they agreed. The next day, the handle was removed. The pump was disabled, and the neighborhood could no longer drink the water. Almost immediately, the outbreak ended. It feels like a movie ending, doesn't it? The hero solves the puzzle. The villain, the pump, is defeated, and the city is saved. But real history is messier. The medical establishment did not applaud John Snow. They attacked him. The leading medical journal, The Lancet, mocked his theory. They asked, "How can water carry disease if the water looks clean?" They couldn't see the bacteria, so they couldn't believe it. It would take another decade and the work of a French scientist named Louis Pasteur to finally prove Snow right. Pasteur would reveal the germ theory, the idea that invisible living microorganisms, not smells, cause disease. This was the death blow for miasma. The invisible enemy finally had a face. But as we transition to the modern world, we must ask ourselves, did miasma really disappear? Or did it just change its name? Today, we don't worry about bad air from swamps, but we do worry about sick building syndrome, pollution, and airborne viruses. The fear of the air we breathe is a primal human instinct. In our final chapters, we will see how the legacy of miasma shaped the modern bathroom, the way we speak, and why we still hold our breath when we walk past a bad smell. The pump handle was gone, the map was drawn, but the language of bad air was about to survive in the most surprising places. The pump handle was removed, but the idea of miasma was not ready to die. It is one thing to prove a theory wrong on a map. It is another thing to change the mind of the entire world. For nearly 20 years after John Snow's discovery, doctors continued to sniff the air. They couldn't help it. It was a habit formed over 2,000 years. The death of miasma required a paradigm shift. This is a fantastic phrase for advanced English learners. A paradigm shift, pronounced paradigm, is a fundamental change in approach or underlying assumptions. It's when the world suddenly looks different because the rules have changed. The paradigm shift happened in a laboratory in France, thanks to Louis Pasteur, and in an operating room in Scotland, thanks to Joseph Lister. Imagine an operating room in the 1860s. It looks nothing like a modern hospital. The surgeon wears a black coat, stiff with dried blood and pus from previous operations. He calls this good old surgical stink. To him, the smell of the coat is a badge of honor. It shows he is experienced. He does not wash his hands between patients. He believes that if the air in the room is good, the patient will survive. But the patients kept dying. Then came the germ theory. Pasteur proved that invisible living things, bacteria, caused fermentation and spoilage. Joseph Lister applied this to human flesh. He realized the enemy wasn't the air itself. It was what was floating in the air and living on the hands. Lister began to spray the operating room with carbolic acid. It was a harsh, burning chemical. It didn't smell like roses. It smelled like industrial cleaner. But for the first time, the patients lived. This redefined the word clean. Under miasma theory, clean meant smelling sweet. Under germ theory, clean meant sterile. To be sterile means to be free from bacteria or other living microorganisms. This new definition changed the look of the world. Have you ever wondered why modern bathrooms and hospitals are often tiled in white? This is a direct legacy of the death of miasma. In the late Victorian era, as germ theory took over, architects began designing sanitary spaces. White tiles show dirt. If you can see the dirt, you can scrub it away. The dark, wood-paneled rooms of the past were replaced by the bright, hard, washable surfaces we use today. The theory of miasma eventually became obsolete. Obsolete is an adjective meaning no longer produced or used. Out of date. Like the floppy disk or the VHS tape, miasma theory was replaced by better technology, the microscope. However, language changes much slower than science. Even though we know miasma is wrong, our English vocabulary is still haunted by its ghosts. We use words every day that are linguistic fossils of this old belief. Let's look at the most famous example: malaria. Malaria is a mosquito-borne disease. But look at the word itself. It comes from the medieval Italian mal, bad, plus area, air. For centuries, people thought the disease came from the foul air of the swamps. They were looking at the swamp gas, not the mosquitoes breeding in the water. We kept the name even after we found the cure. Here's another one: influenza. This is the formal name for the flu. It comes from the Italian word for influence. Medieval doctors believed that epidemics were caused by the influence of the stars aligning or the influence of cold air flowing down from the north. They didn't know it was a virus. Even the way we express emotions is connected. When someone is in a bad mood, we might say they are in a bad humor. This goes straight back to the four humors: blood, bile, etc., that miasma was thought to disrupt. And consider the phrase, a breath of fresh air. Today, we use this metaphorically to mean a welcome change or a new idea. Her new management style is a breath of fresh air. But in the 14th century, this was literal. A breath of fresh air was a medical necessity to avoid death. So miasma theory vanished from the medical books, but it survived in our dictionaries. It also survived in our instincts. Walk down a street today. If you smell a rotting garbage bin, what is your immediate physical reaction? You hold your breath. You quicken your pace. You feel a wave of disgust. Your rational brain knows that the smell of garbage cannot give you the flu. You know that bacteria need to enter your body to make you sick. But your lizard brain, the ancient part of you, still screams, danger, bad air. We are not so different from the medieval peasant. We just have better soap. The journey from bad air to germs was one of the longest, deadliest struggles in human history. It shaped our cities, our laws, and our language. But here's the final, uncomfortable question. Were they completely wrong? In the 21st century, we are facing new threats. We have learned that some viruses are airborne, and we have learned that pollution, modern miasma, can indeed damage our lungs and hearts. In our final part, we will bring this story home. We will summarize the journey, solidify the vocabulary you have learned, and look at how the ghost of miasma has returned in the modern age of pandemics and climate change. We have learned how they died. Now let's look at what they taught us about how to live. The air over London today is different. It is not the smoky fog of the Industrial Revolution, nor is it the stench of the medieval gutter. But if you stand on a street corner and sneeze, watch how people react. They flinch. They step back. For a moment, the ghost of the miasma theory returns. We have traveled a long road together. We started in the mud of 1348, surrounded by terrified citizens burning rosemary to fight a plague they couldn't see. We watched them fumigate their homes, bleed their bodies, and tragically blame their neighbors. We saw how a mistaken belief that smell causes death actually forced kings to clean the streets, creating the sanitation systems we rely on today. We witnessed the birth of the word quarantine in a Venetian port, and we watched a quiet mapmaker named John Snow take the handle off a pump and shut down an epidemic. So, what is the final lesson for us as English learners and students of history? It is a lesson about intuition. Intuition is the ability to understand something immediately, without the need for conscious reasoning. The medieval intuition was that bad air was dangerous. And here is the nuance. They were not entirely wrong. They thought the smell was the weapon. It wasn't. But the air can be a weapon. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the world suddenly remembered what it felt like to fear the atmosphere. We learned new words like aerosol and airborne transmission. We opened windows. We wore masks, not the beak masks filled with herbs, but fabric masks to catch droplets. The science had changed, but the behavior was hauntingly familiar. This brings us to the concept of legacy. A legacy is something handed down from the past. The legacy of the Miasma Theory is everywhere. It is in the plumbing that carries waste away from your house. It is in the fresh air laws that regulate factory pollution. It is in the word malaria. And it is in the English language itself, rich with metaphors about clearing the air or situations that stink. We often look back at the past with arrogance. We think, how could they believe that? But we must remember that science is not a destination. It is a journey. The people of the Middle Ages were using the best data they had. They were trying to make sense of a chaotic world. They were wrong about the mechanism, but they were right about the need for action. Let's end with a powerful noun: resilience. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. Toughness. The story of miasma is a story of human resilience. When the herbs failed, they tried cleaning. When cleaning failed, they tried quarantine. When quarantine failed, they tried science. They never gave up. They kept asking why until they found the answer. As you continue your English learning journey, be like Jon Snow. Don't just accept the prevailing theory. Look at the map. Ask the questions. Look for the anomalies. The air around us is invisible, but the history it holds is heavy. The next time you walk past a sweet-smelling flower shop, or the next time you instinctively hold your breath past a garbage truck, remember the London of 1348. Remember the fear. Remember the mistake. But most of all, remember the people who survived the darkness so that we could live in the light. This has been the London Gritty Chronicles.